chapter, the San Francisco Bay Area chapter, and I want to welcome you and thank you for coming to this INET conference on cyber surveillance. I want to thank CNET for letting us use their lovely facility. I want to thank Declan McCullough, who's a political reporter for CNET, for lending us his voice as moderator, and actually, truth be told, for enabling many of the contacts that we needed to put on an event like this. And I just want to turn things over to Declan McCullough.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of CNET, which is part of CBS Interactive, and this is our building and headquarters here in downtown San Francisco. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for Edward Snowden. He risked his freedom. He's under federal indictment and has been since early June to leak documents that have changed the way many Americans think about the National Security Agency and more broadly the U.S. intelligence and surveillance apparatus. And it's turned into one of the top news stories of the year with disclosures almost every day. In fact, at the beginning it was literally every day, but then that slowed down to a more manageable pace. We already knew quite a bit about the NSA's surveillance apparatus even before Edward Snowden became a household word. Mark Klein, who lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, worked just next door at that building that looks kind of like the Death Star. It's just a half a block in that direction. There are no windows, and it's one of the AT&T facilities. He reported, looking at his sworn affidavit in 2006, that he witnessed domestic voice and internet traffic being surreptitiously diverted through a splitter cabinet. That was room 641A of that monolith of a building, and it was accessible. That room was accessible only to NSA cleared technicians. And we knew from a report about in USA Today around the same time that the NSA was vacuuming up records of all the phone calls that Americans make every day. And we knew from books by James Bamford, who's probably the leading chronicler of the NSA outside the NSA, that the NSA has vacuumed up as much signals intelligence as it could. But what these disclosures have done over the last 4 months is filled in some of the gaps in our knowledge. We didn't know that Section 215 of the Patriot Act has been used and really abused by a secret court. We didn't, to vacuum up our phone calls, we didn't know that intelligence analysts could peruse your email messages, Facebook messages, etc., without asking a judge first. And we had heard rumors, at least I had heard rumors, about the NSA subverting IETF and other standards processes, but we didn't have confirmation until a few weeks ago in the New York Times article. So let me ask our two initial panelists to come up. We have two organizations have done more than almost any other group to litigate against NSA surveillance in this area, and also to argue against it in Washington, D.C. And those are the ACLU and the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And we have Alex, who came all the way from New York today. He's a staff attorney with the National Security Project at the ACLU. And Nate is a staff attorney down the street on EFF's Digital Civil Liberties team, and EFF's new offices maybe a little further away. It's such a broad topic, I'm not really sure even how to begin this conversation. One obvious thing is an article today in Wired, and Kevin Polson had an article there that talked about how Lavabit, an email provider used by Edward Snowden, had received an order to turn over its private SSL encryption keys. Now, I wrote an article in July here at CNET saying that the feds were requesting these, but I didn't name the actual provider. What do you think of this? Is this a legally defensible position, saying turn over the encryption keys and master keys used to encrypt all web traffic?
I'm sorry, I can start. I think it's, well, I should first say thanks, Declan, so much for having us and me in particular, and thanks, Mike and others, and Nicole for organizing. It's an honor to be here. Maybe I can step back 1 second before trying to answer that question, because I think that is a legally, a tricky question. But, at a much broader level, we're at a state now, I think, which is not surprising at all to this audience, in which virtually everything we do leaves some form of digital trail in a way that can be accessible by government. And we're, because of that, having to ask ourselves the question of when the government should be allowed to access that information. Information that in the past historically had been protected primarily not by the law, but by practical obscurity. Information just wasn't kept around for long enough to be accessed in the way that the government is now using technology to access this information. And so one of the questions that arises in this state of affairs where virtually everything we do leaves this digital trail is whether the government can force a service that promises security to its users to compromise the very goal of the service. And it's a tricky question in some respects, in part because up until now we've known very little about the laws that the government would rely upon to ask for these types of records, to ask for the private SSL keys used by Alphabet. And we've known less about the language that appears in some of these laws and how it's interpreted by courts. Whether courts would force a company to compromise its core mission. So maybe I'll leave it at that without actually answering the question. I think it's a tricky question.
We'll get back to it later.
Yeah.
It is a pretty detailed question, but it's also the story in the news today. What do you think?
Well, I think it's important to realize that in the LavaBit situation, there was a single federal magistrate judge who took it upon herself to order this service to compromise its security forever. Once the SSL key is out of the bag, it can never be put back in. And that decision was made in a hurry. And I think that's the most striking thing about this, about what we saw today, is that we saw in the course of just a few days, there was apparently some frantic back and forth legal wrangling over how it was going to be done, what was possible to get at the targeted account, which we assume is Edward Snowden. And the judge didn't understand the technology and so ordered the SSL keys to be turned over. And I think that as a society, we need to step back and think about these things in more of the calm light of day and not in the rush that some of these disclosure orders come in.
Let me interrupt you. The Internet Society, Michael more than anyone, has tried very hard, and I tried quite hard to get someone from the US government here to defend its position. Initially, it would be great to have a debate 2-on-2. I could moderate it, make it a tag team, but it didn't happen. We contacted the FBI and DOJ and the Obama administration in July. They eventually stopped responding to email, which I kind of took as they're not interested. We tried a few other folks, former DOJ and NSA officials, 3 I can think of offhand, and they didn't show up either. Another one stopped responding to emails. Another one said maybe in February. So we tried to balance this a little. So I'm going to have to try be devil's advocate for a moment here and say, let's say there's an actual terrorist ticking bomb. New York or San Francisco could well, there could be a catastrophe here. We all die. In that case, would you agree that a search warrant for an SSL key, if it's the only way we can save millions of people, is appropriate?
You know, I think one of the core types of surveillance that we've noticed since these disclosures began is not the type of targeted surveillance that you're talking about. And I think when you talk about targeted surveillance of a form that's directed at a particular threat, directed at a particular individual, it raises far fewer of the types of concerns that are raised by, for example, the program under which the NSA vacuums up the call records of everyone in the country indiscriminately without regard to whether they are relevant to a ticking time bomb threat or a threat of a particular kind. So, you know, this is another kind of elusive answer. I think I'm far less concerned as a general matter about targeted surveillance than I am about dragnet surveillance, although I think there are important consequences for the government, both when it comes to legitimacy and when it comes to undermining the trust within the very community they need help from to enable their surveillance when they undermine our very best defense against not just NSA surveillance, but against industrial espionage, against surveillance by other countries, against hackers around the world. So it's a very high stakes game the government plays when it undermines that very protection, the protection that we all rely upon to keep not just our communications sensitive, but our financial records secure, our medical records secure, and all other manner of private information.
So ticking time bomb, okay if it's targeted, Nate, where you're willing to say even if it's not targeted, even if it's the SSL key. That's the only thing that will save us.
I think the ticking time bomb situation is something that we don't actually see.
You're arguing with a hypothetical, counselor.
That's exactly right. I think the hypothetical, bad facts make bad law, and
bad hypotheticals make bad panel discussions.
Bad hypotheticals make even worse law. And to go back to what Alex said, and this is something that we were discussing before the panel started, the NSA's cybersecurity mission is twofold, right? It's to protect American government and industry from attacks, and it is to make sure that government communications are secure. It is not to weaken our own defenses, and that's what they've been doing, and that's what a request like the one that went to LavaBit does. It goes so far beyond getting at the communications that the government thought it needed that I think we can say that it is in fact overbroad. It just goes too far.
Let me lob a softball at you, and then I'm going to return to being devil's advocate. What are it's difficult to summarize. I tried and probably failed at the beginning. But what are the most surprising revelations from the last 4 months? It's been very close to 4 months, give or take a day or two of the disclosures. I mean, has anything changed either of your view of the way the NSA conducts surveillance, either legally or technically?
I think some of the most surprising things is that we've seen is the readiness that the one court that has looked at that NSA surveillance, the FISA court in Washington, D.C., I think it's surprising how readily that court has accepted the NSA's arguments. We saw opinions from 2009 that very strongly rebuked the NSA in terms like this court has seen the NSA, has seen the government mislead us repeated times, and yet eventually at the end of the opinion, file another declaration and we'll approve it. That's surprising.
Yeah, I guess I have a couple different surprises. On a factual level, I think you're right, Declan, when you pointed out at the beginning that a lot of these things we knew about in one way or another, but it was easy to kind of adopt this plausible deniability, even our public discourse, about whether the government was in fact vacuum cleaning up all of our phone records. There was a USA Today article in 2006, but there was no document verifying it.
But it was also confirmed independently by the Post and the Times. You had members of Congress quoted anonymously, but on the right committees. I mean, this was never nobody ever attempted to refute it. I mean, it was known, right?
It was known in one sense. I think it becomes a lot more difficult to talk around it when you have, for example, the order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court telling Verizon to turn over records on all of its customers. Another kind of factual, I think, novelty for me was that for so long the government has argued that its surveillance, even when it sweeps up Americans' communications, is regulated in secret by all manner of procedures that the government has. And it turns out, now that we've seen those procedures, what the government calls minimization procedures, that they're not very protective at all. That they, in almost every instance, draw the line in favor of allowing the government to keep even Americans' communications that get swept up in the course of the NSA's gathering of foreign intelligence. That was, another kind of something that shocked me factually. But I think, stepping back a little bit, for the last 10 years, really, the government has argued there's nothing to see here. To the extent that our surveillance programs implicate Americans' privacy, we have oversight by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and we have oversight by Congress. And it turns out that our structures have failed, that both of those methods of oversight are inadequate. Congress is ill-informed. The intelligence committees have a difficult time doing their job. They have an even harder time talking to other members of Congress about what's going on. And the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, in the words of the chief judge, is forced to kind of accept the government's representations at face value. And it turns out that that acceptance came with dramatic consequences for our right to privacy. So, our system of checks and balances has failed. And I think that what, to me, individually as an American, is the most shocking.
And if I could play off that, both sides are pointing the finger at the other party. The FISA court says, look, these things are legal, Congress approved them. Congress says, look, these things are legal, the FISA court approved them. Turns out Congress, the House of Representatives, didn't know about the program. The FISA court thought that it did.
Well, hold on. Some members of Congress knew about the program.
Right. The members on the two intelligence committees, the House Intelligence Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee, It appears that the government led the FISA court to believe that both committees had shared details of the program with the entire Congress. It looks now like the Senate Intelligence Committee shared details or made available details to the Senate. The House Intelligence Committee did not make those details available to the House. And under that logic, if the FISA court is saying, look, it's legal because Congress approved it, if less than a majority of Congress even knew about it, that seems to fail.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, you're opposed to bulk surveillance, and I understand that, but the NSA has probably hundreds of thousands of employees. It certainly is publicly admitted to over 30,000. If you count contractors, I'm guessing it's 6 figures. And where are the abuses? We've had all of these documents, but the documents actually argue against your points in many ways. They have these procedures set up, and the Attorney General signs off on it, and their minimization. They may not be what you like, but it's not saying this isn't even as bad as the IRS scandal, you could argue, because there's no evidence of political motivation. There's no political enemies aren't being snooped on. So there are a few isolated cases out of 30,000 plus employees. Maybe someone's looking up his ex-girlfriend, those are found out, and then the procedures are changed. So six cases of abuse. This is pretty good, right?
It might very well be that there are few abuses. We can't know for sure yet. There's very little transparency around what the NSA has been doing. The disclosures that have been made by the government itself have been grudging and largely made in a selective way to defend the programs. But even putting the abuses aside, I actually think the bigger scandal is not the violations of the law, but what the law itself authorizes. When you're talking about bulk collection, there's this disjunct between what the law says and what the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court says the law says. And that's a very important distinction. That debate should be happening in public, but for years it happened only in secret. And there's no reason that debate shouldn't have happened in public. When it comes to not bulk collection of metadata, but bulk collection in a different sense of our international communications, what is so shocking is that the law is so permissive when it comes to allowing the NSA to sweep up sometimes even our purely domestic calls and emails in the course of supposedly international surveillance. And my concern is less with that a rogue NSA analyst might target a love interest, although I think that's problematic. I'm concerned more that the NSA is allowed to keep Americans' communications, even in the course of targeting foreigners, when the NSA says publicly, we have no interest in the Americans' communications, but they designed the system precisely to allow them to collect them.
I mean, how do you know whether a Gmail address, maybe someone travels, they access the account from all over the place? I mean, if you're intercepting mail, Google uses what we believe to be very strong, probably industry-leading encryption to protect its own stuff. But if you're sending mail from Yahoo to Google, it takes 2 to tango. Yahoo doesn't use TLS, and so the email from Yahoo to Google is going to be sent in the clear, because of Yahoo's fault. Maybe the NSA's position should be, we can only protect the country, and they honestly believe they're protecting the country, at least the folks I've talked to, if we intercept everything and just trust us, and we'll have lots of good procedures. So that doesn't work for you, though?
I should start by saying I don't doubt the motives of those who work in government. I think they do believe they're doing the right thing. The question, though, is one that should not be left to the NSA alone to decide what the balance is between our right to privacy and our right to self-defense. There's a core component of self-government is sufficient transparency to allow self-government. But specifically to your question, a reasonable system, given that ambiguity, might allow the NSA to look at the communication, at least to decide, is this person a US person or not? And then if they are, to destroy it. And it turns out that's not what happens. If the NSA mistakenly acquires communications that turn out to be Americans' communications, and even if in retrospect they therefore have no authority to collect them in the first instance, their procedures nonetheless allow them to keep them for at least 5 years, and in some cases indefinitely, depending on if they fit within a number of very broad exceptions to the rule, which turns out not to be much of a rule at all.
And to go back to your initial premise about there not being much abuse here,
we have no evidence of it.
I don't think we can say that.
6 people looking, well, I mean, you're arguing that lack of evidence is evidence.
When the system is designed specifically to make sure that no evidence of abuse comes forward, then yeah. The 12 cases of love interest abuse that we know of were all self-reported. The NSA and they don't define that as abuse. We learned a couple of weeks ago. When it's self-reporting and when you play word games with what is abuse, when you intentionally target a US person, that's not abuse. When you intentionally target your ex-girlfriend, that's not abuse. What is abuse under those definitions? And the word games that the NSA plays have been so pervasive that understanding their answer to how many cases of abuse have there been, and they say 3 or they say now 12. It's difficult, right? Because if they are not giving you a straight if not giving themselves a straight answer, then they can't give the court, they can't give Congress, and they can't give us a straight answer.
So both of your organizations have filed lawsuits since the revelations came out. In fact, EFF's lawsuit, I think in early July, had some local Second Amendment groups as well. I think Gun Owners of California and another one, I can't remember. It's not the Second Amendment Foundation, but
CalGuns Foundation.
Thank you. There's EFF especially. I mean, you've been litigating quite a bit. In fact, there's someone sitting on a laptop in the corner who's been doing a lot of your litigation. Hi, Kurt. And you keep losing. I've been following these cases for the better part of a decade. And
we haven't finished the lawsuits yet.
It's true, and they won at the district court on the national security letter case. But the courts say this is secret. The Bush administration says state secret privilege. This gets tossed out of court. The Obama administration says the same thing, maybe even a bit more energetically. And then the cases get tossed out of court, or they get derailed. Is this going to happen with your current cases?
No. As you know, Declan, the first case that we filed, which was Hepting versus AT&T, was tossed out of court after Congress passed a law tossing it out of court. The second case that we filed, Juul versus NSA, is very much alive and kicking. The government is finally being forced to admit that these programs exist. Until now, they've said that even the bare existence of these programs is a state secret, and they can't defend the lawsuit without endangering national security. Now, the existence of the programs have been declassified. The government has a December 20th deadline to go back and release redacted versions of all of the classified declarations that they've submitted. So I think it is unfair to say we've been losing. We lost Hepting because Congress passed a law. And Juul is...
You kept fighting after that.
And we did.
About retroactive immunity that Senator Obama said he would not support until he did.
Until President, yeah.
And until, midway through, until he had the nomination locked up.
Voted for it. Right, but Juul is very much alive. The district court kicked it out for lack of standing. The Ninth Circuit reversed and sent it back. And now we're before Judge White. In terms of the 215 programs, do you want to talk about?
Sure. I don't think we'll have a standing problem when it comes to challenging the Verizon program. It turns out that the ACLU is a client of Verizon Business Network Services. Someone joked that we were the only happy Verizon customer in the country after the order was leaked. But
we're not Verizon.
One of I think a broader kind of observation, Declan, which is that there's a tension between the government's confidence in the legality of these programs and the efforts that they've undertaken to prevent the legality of these programs from being determined in public by a court. And I think that works a very kind of corrosive effect on our democracy, where you have government officials who say, we have a secret court interpreting these laws. We promise you there's adequate oversight. We promise you this court is deciding what the Constitution means. In effect, creating a body of law that only a handful of government officials are authorized to see, but that affect the privacy rights of millions of Americans. That's very damaging. Even if the government ultimately prevails in these cases, I think it will have been a significant benefit to force the government to defend these programs in public. And we shouldn't. I don't want to leave the impression that the government is willingly defending these programs in public. This debate was forced upon the government.
I thought the president said he welcomed this debate.
The president welcomed the debate after, it's funny, both EFF and the ACLU have Freedom of Information Act lawsuits asking for information about the way in which Section 215 of the Patriot Act has been used. And we both asked about it because in 2011, 2 senators were running around with their hair on fire screaming, "You'll be shocked at what you see when you see these secret interpretations of law." We both took the invitation of Senators Wyden and Udall and filed FOIA requests. And for years, the government argued that releasing even a single word about its secret interpretation of Section 215 would cause grave damage to the national security.
Releasing the number of pages that that interpretation comprised would damage national security.
And at the very moment that the Snowden disclosures happened, we were both actively in court, briefing the question of whether these documents could be released. And the government had, in our suit, I think had a week before which it was going to file its extensive declaration making this argument. They may have already filed it in EFF's lawsuit. And then the disclosures happened, and all of a sudden the administration changes its tune. I think it's great that the administration has welcomed the debate, but the administration is also the entity keeping secret the facts we need to have the debate. So take from that what you will, but we're having the debate now, which is great.
A question, I mean, this is more a question for the ACLU because EFF doesn't have a DC lobby presence, and you do it in an effective one. But a good mental model since the 1970s has been the NSA kind of gets to do what it wants as long as it doesn't get too far in front of what public opinion permits. If anything, the ratchet effect has been working in its favor. I mean, I can't think of any significant laws since the 1970s that have reined in NSA surveillance. I mean, the counter-argument is that maybe it only ramped up circa 2001. Is this going to change? What do you actually see happening there? You've been losing for 30 years.
Well, I don't know whether we've been losing. We only started losing it after 9/11, I think. In 1978, Congress overhauled the surveillance system by passing the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and it created a special court to oversee individualized applications for surveillance orders. And I think the public was accepting of that statute in large part because it was a reaction to the reports of the Church and Pike committees, which found rampant abuses by the NSA. And the law was meant to impose meaningful limits on the NSA's ability to surveil Americans. After 2001, the NSA began asking this court, which had previously been issuing individualized orders, to start issuing bulk orders, to not just apply a kind of fact-based standard to surveillance applications, but to create a new body of law. And so there was a disparity between what the public knew about what the government was doing and what the government was in fact doing in secret. And so I don't think it's fair to characterize the public as having assented to the NSA's secret expansion of its surveillance authorities. But you're right that the NSA has...
You could argue the opposite. I mean, the Patriot Act was enacted a month and a half or so after 9/11. You had, I think every portion that I can think of that's relevant has been renewed. Then you had the FISA Amendments Act, and then you had the FISA Amendments Act, Section 702, that's used, as far as we know, to do fiber optic bulk surveillance, the real stuff, as opposed to just metadata from Verizon. I mean, that was renewed just last year, was it?
Right, but
you keep losing.
So.
There's a theme emerging.
There it is. EFF filed an amicus brief in the ACLU lawsuit against the 215 program on behalf of Representative Sensenbrenner. The government's, the biggest justification of the government for these programs is the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply, but more so, Congress authorized it. Representative Sensenbrenner wrote the Patriot Act. He wrote Section 215, and he said, no, it doesn't. So.
And if there were a Republican in the White House, he might have come out differently on this policy question.
Hey, that's certainly possible, but luckily for now, there isn't. So I think it's not exactly fair to say we've been losing. So after 9/11, the NSA started getting the data that it's getting now, but the FISA court didn't issue its first order until 2004, and it didn't issue its first order under 215 until 2007?
2006.
The collection was going on without any court oversight between 2001 and 2004. So to say that we've been losing entirely, I think the public, as soon as the USA Today article hit in 2006, there has been some change, and that change is going to be incremental. And I think the oversight, now that that people, now that NSA spying is a dinner table conversation, I think the actual strong oversight is inevitable.
You're right, though, Declan, that the FISA Amendments Act, at least, was something that was passed publicly, and a number of organizations, ours included, argued, we thought very loudly, that this language, seemingly opaque, in fact authorizes essentially dragnet collection of Americans' international communications in a very, very troubling way. The government's response to our claim that it did that in our lawsuit, and we challenged, we filed a lawsuit challenging the FISA Amendments Act, I think within 45 minutes of the enactment of the statute. We were in court. We were, and the government's response was, this is all speculative. It's speculative to think that we'll use the FISA Amendments Act in this way. It's speculative to think that the Secret Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court will interpret it to authorize a type of surveillance that you're worried about. And now that the surveillance has been publicly described and that our worries turned out to be correct, the government has changed its tune again and said, what are you talking about? We all knew about this. And yet, in the Supreme Court itself, the government argued that, it's speculative to suspect it's being used in this way. And on the basis of those representations, they had our lawsuit thrown out on standing by a vote of 5-4. And I wonder whether any one of those 5 would have switched their vote had we had, for example, the minimization procedures that the government told the Supreme Court were so important to protecting Americans' privacy rights, when it turns out that they don't, in fact, protect Americans' privacy rights.
Minimization procedures, if I recall properly, say if it's encrypted data, we can keep it kind of indefinitely. And anytime you log into your webmail, except for Yahoo and AOL, it's encrypted by default. Anytime you have an HTTPS bank connection, it's encrypted by default. So that can be kept indefinitely?
That's right.
That's how I read them.
Yeah. There are 3 main exceptions for when the government can keep Americans' communications under the FISA Amendments Act. The first is if it contains foreign intelligence, which is defined extremely broadly, not just about terrorism, which is important to understand. To hear the government describe this program, you think all they're listening to are suspected terrorists, when in fact they can use it to listen to a US journalist talking to a Yemeni journalist about the reporting on drone strikes on the ground, because that pertains to the foreign affairs, which is part of the definition of foreign intelligence. And the second is when it contains evidence of a crime, and the third is encryption. And so those exceptions, create an enormous loophole for the government to keep communications. But even if our communications are picked up and do not fit one of those exceptions, the government can still keep our communications for 5 years. The exceptions allow them to keep them indefinitely. So it's very troubling what the government is allowed to do under the FISA Amendments Act.
Well, so you mentioned encryption. Let's go back to encryption for a moment. I mean, it seems like that these are where some of the more interesting Snowden revelations are coming from. And we trust encryption to do 2 things, and that is store the data at rest and also store data in transit. And we've known about AT&T participating in the NSA fiber tap program through room 641A right down the road. For a while, but sort of the breadth and the details haven't been public before. What do you think of some of the encryption revelations and things like subverting the standards process? I mean, this was the subverting the standards process was pretty alarming.
It was. So it's interesting to see how the NSA's role has changed over the years here. Going back to when NSA, in the last set of encryption standards, came in and said, sort of out of nowhere, this in your S box in RSA, why don't you just change this and don't worry about it, we're making it stronger. Something like 12 years later, it was discovered, a new class of cryptographic attack was discovered, and it turned out the NSA's tweak actually did make the standard stronger. Now we find out that Suite B, the NIST standards, were intentionally undermined by the NSA. That shift in the way that the NSA is dealing with encryption, going from trying to make our communications stronger and protect them from foreign governments, from bad actors, to trying to make everyone's communications less secure so that the NSA themselves can get at it. I think that distinction, that switch in NSA policy, is really disturbing.
I agree with Nate, and I think there are 2 really striking parts about the encryption disclosures. The first is that, as Nate was saying earlier, the very same officials who are warning us that the next big attack on the United States will be a cyber attack are the same officials who are systematically undermining our best protection against a cyber attack by undermining the standards that we rely upon to keep our communications secure, to keep our information secure when it's stored at rest or in transit. I think that's very problematic, and it's one of the reasons why the game that the government is playing is so high stakes. Another reason, another kind of what startled me about the encryption revelation is that the government, relies upon these standards. Or I guess the government's attacks upon these standards will have will cause a broader shift in the way that the internet is structured and services are distributed around the world. When manufacturers stop using, for example, secure components coming from the United States or relying upon software that comes from the United States, the NSA loses what it has historically called its home field advantage, which is the fact that so much internet traffic and so much of what secures the internet either derives from United States processes or is routed through the United States. And so there's going to be a backlash against the system that the NSA has set up to enable this type of surveillance. And it'll have, I think, long-term consequences for the NSA's ability to do this work because it overreached.
Let me interrupt you. We talked about U.S. telecommunications companies, AT&T and Verizon. They have very large contracts with the government. They've had very close, cozy relationships even with the government, stretching back the better part of a century. But we're out here at the very northern tip of Silicon Valley. Let's talk about companies out here. They say, I think a lot of the initial reporting on PRISM, as I described in a CNET article at the time, was incorrect. There's no evidence of direct access to Silicon Valley companies' servers, and all the CEOs have said we get something like thousands, not millions, of requests per year for all different government agencies for everything, including lost pets or Alzheimer's patients wandering off, and then maybe double that for the number of accounts affected. But then how do you reconcile that with bulk surveillance? I mean, is this all done via fiber taps? And the second question is, do the laws that allow the government to request confidential personal information from U.S. companies need to change?
You want to start, or?
Well, I was just going to say we don't know enough yet about how the description of the PRISM program that we saw in the slides actually fits with what's going on the ground. The companies had never heard the word PRISM. They don't give direct access to the servers. We don't know what that means either.
They've elaborated. There's no direct access. If we have a lawful search warrant for a murderer, in Google's case, they told Wire they tar up the files and FTP them to a government server. That's the opposite of direct access, right?
Well, the lawyer answer is maybe. If the NSA has Google's private keys, then they don't need direct access because they can see everything in flight.
No, they can't, because Google is alone in using perfect forward secrecy. They would need to do an active attack, and there's no evidence they do that. But let's put that aside for the moment.
Putting that aside, one of the ways in which they still enable this kind of dragnet surveillance is by tapping, as you suggested, the upstream architecture. And we know from a story in the New York Times that the government actively sits on the international gateway switches where information is coming into or out of the country, reconstructs the packets in transit, keeps a copy of them temporarily, searches them for suspicious keywords or keywords of some sort relating to foreign intelligence, and then keeps the ones that they're interested in and discards the rest. So there are ways that the government kind of affects its dragnet surveillance, even when it comes to communications going into or out of Google or into or out of Microsoft. I think the PRISM program is just a different way in which it accesses this information.
There's both your organizations are longtime members of a coalition called the Digital Due Process Coalition, which is saying, well, there are a few principles, but one of them is a warrant should be required for domestic law enforcement criminal requests for information. And after a Sixth Circuit ruling, the companies have basically been doing this anyway. But let's talk just about national security, NSA, terrorism, foreign intelligence, something or other requests. Should the law be tightened? I mean, EFF has won a round on the national security letter front. Now, if you were emperor for a day, how would you fix the law?
I mean, there is no national security exemption to the Fourth Amendment.
That's in the fine. That's a classified version.
It's in the fine print, right? Maybe there is a national security exemption to the Fourth Amendment in some classified FISA court opinion that we haven't seen yet, but the founders didn't intend it. So I think the Fourth Amendment, as it is, You said earlier that the first DDP, the first Digital Due Process Coalition principle, was that a warrant should be required for criminal investigations to get at content. And that's almost right, but I believe the principle is a warrant is required to get to content. That we think that's the way the law is now. It's not what ECPA says.
Well, 10 years ago, everyone would have laughed at you, but once you got an appellate court ruling in your favor, now people think, hey, you were ahead of your time.
And I will point at Susan Freewald, who will be coming later, but we have her in part to thank for that. Do you want to?
Yeah, I would do two things if I were emperor for a day when it comes to the substance of the law. The first is that I would end bulk collection. I don't think there's any cause for the government, whether it's metadata or content, to acquire our information en masse. It should target its efforts. That's when the intelligence agencies are at their best. That's when their interests are when their interests are served in a tailored way. When it comes to our international surveillance, I would default to the mode that was set up by Congress in 1978 when it passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is when the government wants to surveil an American in the course of gathering foreign intelligence, it should get an individualized court order. It shouldn't be allowed to bootstrap away our right to privacy by claiming, no, we're just targeting a foreigner abroad, and so we're allowed to pick up your communications too. I think that gives too short shrift to our right to privacy, even in our international conversations. And I'm not alone in making that suggestion. Senator Obama in 2008, when the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Amendments Act, the FISA Amendments Act, was being considered, co-sponsored an amendment that would have done two things that are critically important. The bill wouldn't have fixed the FISA Amendments Act. It's not a perfect fix, but these two limitations were very reasonable and important. First, it would have prohibited the government from acquiring Americans' communications in the course of its international surveillance unless it had a court order. And second, and this is important because we know the NSA permissively sweeps things in and only later on checks to see what it has. Second, it would have told the government, if you discover that an American communication nonetheless made it past your front-end filter, then you can't look at it until you get an order from the secret FISA court. So I think those would have been some very rational amendments to the FISA Amendments Act that would have preserved the NSA's ability to target foreigners for surveillance while not compromising Americans' right to privacy in the course of that surveillance. Can I make one caveat, and maybe, I don't mean to, I've been talking for a while, but...
Well, no, actually, if there's caveats, let me ask you this. Are there any areas where you two disagree on this? I mean, you two would have been on the same team if we actually got some federal officials to show up for a debate, or even ex-officials, but are any difference, maybe nuances and tactics, or do you both are singing Kumbaya?
I mean, we filed in the Northern District of California, and they filed in the Southern District of New York.
That's the best you can do?
I don't know what the differences are. Maybe at the margins we have slight differences in our understandings of what the future is of technology and privacy, but I think we're largely in lockstep right now. The one caveat I was going to make maybe is a source of disagreement, I don't know. Most of our conversation tonight and most of the conversation in the country has focused on the right to privacy of Americans when the government is conducting foreign intelligence surveillance. And there's a separate conversation that needs to happen with respect to international privacy. Privacy is not just a civil right, it's also a human right. It's something that all are entitled to, not just Americans. And it raises concerns if every country has laws as permissive as ours when it comes to targeting foreigners, then you don't have to have all that many intelligence alliances to get information about your own citizens by going to another country that's spying on your own citizens. It's a conversation where I don't think as a country we're ready to start having until we at least resolve some of the basic principles about Americans' rights. But it's a critically important one, and it's one that our allies abroad will force us to have, I think, in the nearer term, because they're concerned about the surveillance that's going on, and because American businesses are at a competitive disadvantage when they can't sell their products to foreigners because foreigners worry about doing business, in essence, with the NSA.
Even though the US and Canada, if you look at domestic wiretaps, are way at the bottom per capita in the Netherlands, and Scandinavian countries are way at the top.
Well, if you're talking about content and communications, then perhaps, but if you're talking about call records, then I think we are probably at the very top.
It would be nice to see that data, but I suspect that the European security services are pretty embedded in their often government-owned providers. But let me hold that off for a second. Turn this over to the audience. You folks have questions. I've been going on for a while. If you could identify yourself, that would be great. If not, I'm going to have to keep trying to play devil's advocate and largely failing.
So I have a not really hypothetical, but something that actually happened. The attacks involved.
Hold on one sec. We apparently have microphones that are circulating. If not, I'll give you mine.
Thank you. So not exactly hypothetical, but the attacks that happened in Bombay in 2008 and the communications that were captured weren't really targeted. I believe they were captured in due course and just happened to surface. I'm not privy to all the details, but without bulk capturing of data, again, I'm not really favoring it, but just putting out a situation where bulk capturing of data did come in handy perhaps to detect activity and figure out who was involved while the situation was actually happening.
So the question is, you had a question for these folks?
Where do you stand in terms of catching activities like this, where A, it is surfacing through bulk capturing of data, B, it doesn't directly involve the U.S., it's a third country, 2 other countries are involved. Where do we stand in terms of legalities with that?
Sure, I can start. I think the way you phrase the question when it comes to bulk collection is a little bit different than the way I would phrase the question. It's of course true that if you draw your circle ever broader, the needle will be somewhere in the haystack. The question when it comes to surveillance is whether the government can accomplish its ends without resorting to that kind of dragnet surveillance. And I'm not particularly familiar with the surveillance that happened in the Bombay incidents, but I'm a bit more familiar with the supposed success stories that the government has touted out in the aftermath of the Snowden disclosures. And not one of the ones that I've seen is actually an example of a form of surveillance that had to be dragnet to allow the government to do what it wanted to do. The government could have targeted surveillance. And in fact, even under the bulk collection program, the collection of our phone records in bulk, the government's surveillance its collection is dragnet, but its interest is in fact targeted. It doesn't randomly sift through, so far as we know, the data. It goes to the data with a particular phone number it wants to know who's been in contact with that phone number, and it queries the database. It's a targeted search. In some respects, that's going on the back end. I mean, the collection is not targeted. But this query on the back end is targeted, and there's little reason the government couldn't, for that reason, target its surveillance collection so that it grabs the information it needs in a targeted way as opposed to a dragnet one.
Nate, anything to add? Or?
I mean, the Bombay attacks story, and again, I'm not familiar with the details either, but it doesn't sound like a success story, right? The bulk collection did not prevent the attack.
No, it was caught during the act, which went on for 3 days.
And once the attack got going, there's no need for bulk collection anymore, right? You can absolutely target. I mean, once you know something, you can target it. So I think that's pretty strong. And then legally, there's a clear distinction between surveillance that's happening entirely foreign and surveillance that's happening here.
Let's take another question from the audience. I'll walk around with the microphone. Yes, sir. Hold on a sec. If you could identify yourself, that would be lovely.
I'm James Rule from UC Berkeley. I'm wondering, is there any conceivable justification or historical precedent, in your view, for a court that hears only one side of disputes and whose decisions are not made public and hence subject to debate and review, either court review or other kinds of review? Has there ever been a court like this before in American history?
There is precedent for courts operating in limited circumstances in secret. Often when the government goes to a court and says, we want a search warrant issued against this particular individual, those proceedings typically take place in secret. Usually they're opened up at some point later on to review by someone else. What's, I think, unique about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is that for the first 23 years, it was largely doing that kind of limited, targeted, secret process. But after 9/11, it turned into a court issuing broad legal decisions in a manner that did not need to be secret and had historically never been secret. We haven't had a court that has issued constructions of the Constitution, in some ways authoritative constructions of the Constitution in secret. And that's what I think is most problematic about what the court is doing.
I think that's exactly right. In the search warrant context, in the grand jury context, all of these courts operate one-sided. They only hear the government, they issue their process, and then it opens up. And in the FISA court, it operates one-sided. The court issues its process, and we never hear about it again. We've never heard about it to begin with. So your question had two parts. It said, you asked, is there any precedent for courts operating in this one-sided secret manner? Yes. Is there any precedent for courts operating in this one-sided secret manner without ever being open to public review? Nope.
I think we have a question from the fellow who organized this event, so he gets to jump the queue. Michael?
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having us.
So one of the things that has really kind of leapt out at me in the reading that I've done is that the highly touted FISA court is really inadequate for a couple of reasons. One is there's really no meaningful oversight. You kind of got to trust that these are men with conviction and cojones and women of conviction and whatever the equivalent would be. But it seems from what I've read that there's not enough of the court members available at any given moment in time to meet the perceived need for the warrants. I mean, there are tales of them dragging these people out of bed at 2 o'clock in the morning to have some kind of an ad hoc session on some urgent requirement. And so it's not just kind of policy. Is this a good policy to have a FISA court that has really no meaningful oversight? But if you're really going to do this, is there enough invested in that infrastructure to be effective at making the decisions?
So the dragging a judge out of bed at 2 in the morning to sign a warrant, that comes with the territory, right? That superior court judges do it, district court judges do it. Such is the life of a duty judge. With life tenure comes great responsibility, I would say. But that role is very different than the oversight role. The signing an individual emergency warrant in the middle of the night to get communications of somebody because we need it right now is exceedingly different than giving a new interpretation to the Constitution that will apply to everyone for all time, that no one will hear about it. And the fact that the court, as Alex said, used to kind of only do the former and now does mostly the latter is a problem.
I agree, and the only thing I would add is that I'm actually not so sure I believe that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is a rubber stamp in the way that a lot of people suggest. I think the judges who do the work on that court that they do it in earnest. I think they're
I would agree with you, by the way, from the reading that I've done.
Right. And
are you hedging your bets because you have litigation pending before it?
No, I'm not. It's difficult to read their opinions and come away thinking that they're doing their job carelessly. I think they're doing their job very seriously. I think they take their job seriously. I think the structure is set up in such a way that prevents them from doing the job adequately because they only hear from the government. They're supposedly deciding what the Constitution means in a way that applies very, very broadly without hearing from those who have a vested interest in a different reading. And it's problematic. They also have very little oversight from any other court. The government is generally the only party that appeals. The government almost always wins, and there's no one to appeal the decision to a higher court. And so you don't have a situation in which, for example, the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land, is deciding what the Constitution means. You have a situation where a handful of individual judges are deciding what the Constitution means.
Can I claim a ticket for an additional question? So one of the arguments that I've seen put forward by some of the kind of proponents for continued surveillance is, and by the NSA itself, is that the data gathering is not really meaningful. So they take this data and they store it on some server someplace, and their allegation is that it's not really meaningful until they actually do the analysis, right? So it's encrypted, and they store it on their encrypted servers, and it's not really meaningful in terms of constitutionality or individual rights until they actually make the decision to decrypt it and analyze it and make use of it. Do you think that's a specious argument?
I do. I mean, I think it's wrong. There's no basis in law for it, and I think it's also very, very dangerous. If you think about what the consequence of that argument would be, and the argument is collection is not something that triggers the Constitution, just later review. A consequence of that argument is the government truly can collect everything now, and the Constitution only applies later on. The government could, in theory, keep a catalog of everything in your house and only review it when it has a cause to. It could install, if it didn't violate any trespass laws, video monitoring in your house and only look at the video when it had a reason to. The Constitution has never been interpreted that way, and nor has, I think, Congress understood electronic surveillance to work that way. It's criminal both to wiretap without using the information, and it's separately criminal to use the fruits of an illegal wiretap.
EFF's case against the 215 program, against the bulk telephone metadata collection program, is premised more in the First Amendment as well. And I think this is important. It's not just privacy that we're talking about. It's the rest of the Constitution as well. Our clients are, our lead plaintiff is the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles. We have a Jewish organization. We have the Council for American Islamic Relations. We have Greenpeace. We have a medical marijuana advocacy organization. We have, as Declan, you mentioned, the Cal Guns Foundation. These are organizations who are doing brave, difficult work. If they know that the government is listening to them, and by listening, I mean mapping their associations, seeing who's calling them, who they're emailing, who are members of the organizations, if they know that the government is keeping track of who is associating with them, there will be chilling effects. And it's those chilling effects that happen at the mere collection point. They don't happen when the government reads it. They happen when you pick up your phone and you're dialing your Planned Parenthood office. If you know the government is going to know that you called the Planned Parenthood office, you might think twice about doing it. Or if you're calling your NORML, the marijuana legalization office, you might think twice about doing it. And it's that chilling effect that happens at the point where the NSA gets the data, not at the point where they look at the data.
So the answer is that Snowden should be stopped, fewer disclosures, fewer chilling effects, better freedom. Let's take another question from the audience. I saw your hand first. You could identify yourself, please.
I'm Brian Pascal with the UC Hastings Privacy and Technology Project. It seems to me that sort of the elephant in the room with all of this is like that the technology is fundamentally diverging from the legal understanding of this, both in Congress, in front of the courts, and even within the NSA. You had like Alexander saying that we don't even know what the tech guys were doing at that point. So how do we get better at this in the future? Because it seems like the technology is just going to get more complex in the future, and it doesn't seem like, say, Congress is too keen on really getting up to speed on the fact that metadata is kind of important.
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is have an open debate about it. We have to know what's going on, and we have to debate it publicly. And we see this in all areas of the law. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act was passed in 1986 and hasn't been updated meaningfully since. We saw it in the LavaBit case that was disclosed today. The magistrate judge there had no understanding of the technology involved. We see that in the FISA court opinions. The judges there seem to be talking about multiple communications transactions and single communications transactions without actually knowing what those terms mean. But open debate will help us get there, I think.
I agree, and I think there's a broader role for technology. The government, I think, seems to view the advance of technology as a one-way ratchet when it comes to our constitutional rights. They seem to only argue that because technology is advancing, the government needs to be able to take better advantage of that technology to use it for surveillance or to use it toward whatever end, without recognizing that there similarly needs to be a recognition that constitutional privacy understandings evolve also with the advent of new technology. And we haven't had that kind of course correction when it comes to the understanding of a right to privacy, because the debate, as Nate said, has been secret for the last 10 years, because we don't know the ways in which the government has turned this new technology toward surveillance.
So what about Jones?
maybe we'll have, some, we may not say the exact same thing about Jones. Maybe there's an area for us to talk about. But, Jones is a fascinating case. And Jones is the GPS surveillance case in which the court held that it is a trespass to place a GPS surveillance device on a car. But 5 justices also said that placing a GPS surveillance device on a car implicates a right to privacy because you have a right to privacy in the aggregation of your movements. That when the government tracks you over the long term, it invades your right to privacy. And it's a tremendously important case because it stands for the principle, at least if you read those 5 justices' words seriously, that accumulations of seemingly innocuous information that has not always enjoyed constitutional protection, can nonetheless trigger constitutional protection. That phone records, perhaps in isolated form, are not so deserving of constitutional protection, but when aggregated are. So it's an important debate. It's a difficult one, I think, to have in the abstract because there are, no technology is the same as any other technology. No piece of this type of information, whether it's a piece of metadata or another type of third-party business record, is the same. Maybe you have broader views about Jones than I do.
No, I think that's right. I think the Sotomayor concurrence is the one that we really need to be looking to going forward. The FISA court in August of this year said that a Fourth Amendment interest does not spring into existence when aggregating a whole bunch of little pieces of information, none of which Americans have privacy interest in. The 5 justices on the Jones court said not so. The FISA court didn't even cite Jones. So I think that we need to be looking, we do need to look to Jones, and we need to re-examine whether our Fourth Amendment interests do apply to aggregations of data which individual data points might not be particularly sensitive.
Okay, let's have time for 1 or 2 more questions, depending on the length of the response. Here's one.
Yes, my name is Ellen Ullman, and I am one of those annoying people who have 2 questions. One is for both of you. I'm not sure the discussion of privacy is that useful because of the constitutional question about a right of privacy. What about the freedom of association that is implied in this? I feel that is possibly the stronger constitutional argument. The second is probably more for you, Declan. Alex, you mentioned, I believe, you said the internet is ruptured. And those of us who have been around for a long time in the technology may remember that the internet was designed to be collegial. It did not have much security by design. And the security and the encryption were added features and have been leaky ever since. So there are 2 questions. One is the aftermath of that decision about what the internet is, a kind of not understanding about the underlying technology of the internet. And the next is how we deal with that mistake.
Oh my, either of you want to take the first, or should I try the second?
So, sure, I'll take the first. I agree with you entirely that the associational interests implicated by NSA collection are paramount, and that's why EFF filed the first Unitarian versus NSA lawsuit. I think I couldn't state it any better than you did.
Yeah, I agree with Nate entirely. A lot of people argue that the notion that people might be deterred from having certain conversations on the basis of this Dragnet collection is a bit speculative. And I think it's important to understand that, maybe you believe that a single person hesitating to visit a controversial website a single time is not particularly interesting from a constitutional perspective. But as more people hesitate to have controversial conversations, to email friends abroad, to visit controversial websites, those hesitations in the aggregate can have the effect of closing an open society. And it's difficult to appreciate that harm because it is by its very nature an intangible one. It's one that we only notice in its absence, and it's one that we only notice far down the road. It's the slippery slope, and so it's what a lot of people fear when it comes to this form of surveillance.
I mean, to try to answer your second question, the internet was designed in a more innocent era. I remember I've been on since 1988. I was And I remember initially at the MIT Media Lab, they had an account without a password, so anyone could just log in and use their machines. I think Richard Stallman had something to do with this. And if you look at the design of the protocols, I mean, email is unencrypted. It's hopelessly broken today. It can be forged. It can be intercepted. I mean, it's utterly insane that if you send mail from exchange Hotmail between Gmail and or mail between Hotmail and Gmail or AOL mail, it takes two to tango. Google's happy to encrypt, but those other three companies will not. Microsoft will only for paying customers, not for free Hotmail or Outlook.com. So why is this? It's because people haven't been demanding it until very recently, and we still don't have it. And even the TLS standard used is still out of date and broken. And how do you actually verify that a server is what it says it is? It is broken, and the only good thing is that in the wake of the last month's disclosures, and especially the New York Times article, we're finally seeing groups like the IETF move to take this a bit more seriously. I mean, right now it's just more in the draft standards and discussion drafts, but it's going to happen, I think. Let's take one quick question. I saw your hand first.
Yeah, I'm getting kind of confused.
I'm sorry, hold on a sec.
Competitive edge on the technology with BitTorrent, or otherwise known as Napster, okay, in terms of privacy and security. And I'm not really sure what's happened to that. Maybe you can update us on it. It seems like those technologies were snuffed.
So sorry, so what technologies?
BitTorrent and like Napster. Okay, this was a way of encrypting and breaking it up so that it couldn't track down the origin of the person.
I don't think BitTorrent was ever designed to anonymize communications. Tor was certainly designed to anonymize communications. And those technology, I memean, projects like Tor are still very much alive and kicking. We hope that the NSA hasn't undermined them too much.
Yeah, I mean, BitTorrent, I'll just differentiate between the protocol and the company. I mean, the company, last I checked, was a few blocks down Folsom Street in that direction, or Howard Street in that direction. And Napster is now, last I checked, was bought by Bertelsmann AG, the publishing conglomerate. But the better, it's more like those technologies may not be considered modern nowadays, but it is things like Tor. On the other hand, it's very easy. If you want to stay anonymous online, it's very difficult to remain anonymous completely. We saw that with today's indictment of the alleged Silk Road proprietor. If you're up against a nation state, you might well lose. Let's take a 5-minute break and bring up the panel. The restrooms are down the hall on your left, and please finish the food. I'll see you in 5. Okay, folks, let's get started. Phase 2 of this exciting evening. So we have three folks to continue the discussion. And one of them is a former MPAA Hollywood studio official. Which one is that? Come on, take it.
Wow, what an introduction. I better get the mic.
There's.
Good evening. I'm Paul Brigner, and I did work for the MPAA for a year. But right now I'm with the Internet Society. I'm the North American Regional Bureau Director for the Internet Society, working to sponsor this event with the Internet Society chapter here in the San Francisco Bay Area. They do a great job. It's a great group. I do hope you are all members. If you're not, I hope you get engaged. If you'd like to learn about the Internet Society, you know Mike, and there's many others here. Please raise your hand if you're in the chapter. So talk to one of these individuals and learn about the Internet Society.
But Paul, I wasn't done with my introduction. I would have said, well, that's just how I knew you. And, so, and you've gone on to do wonderful work, especially things like content restrictions online and copyright policy at the Internet Society. And more importantly for this evening's event, you hauled about 6 large Pelican cases of AV gear here all the way from Virginia to make the webcast happen.
Hopefully it paid off. Thank you.
We also have Susan, who is at the University of San Francisco School of Law and was one of the founding members of the Digital Due Process Coalition, which has been pushing for this idea long before it became law that warrants should actually be required for things like location and the contents of your email. Imagine that. And we have Matthew as well, who's a former Facebook privacy team member and co-founder of Plotly, which is a funded graphing and analytics startup. Actually, Matthew, let me ask you this. What were you doing at Facebook? Privacy team member is kind of vague.
So I worked on our privacy and product team, so we managed a lot of the cross-functional privacy reviews for products before they went out.
So this is kind of
also did like product management for privacy-specific things.
So this is making sure that the products were not terribly privacy invasive.
We like to think good on privacy.
Okay, I accept the correction. But you wouldn't be dealing with responses to law enforcement or other governmental requests for data?
No, I wouldn't.
And do you have any insight into how Facebook or other Silicon Valley companies deal with such requests?
Yeah.
Okay, well, then you're allowed to stay on the panel. Susan, maybe you can give us a high-level overview of what the most important portions of the disclosures to you that Edward Snowden and other reports illuminated over the last few months, and what needs to be fixed.
Okay, well, that's a big question. The most important disclosures for me, first of all, the prior two panelists did a phenomenal job up here, and they're doing a phenomenal job in their litigation work, and I think we owe them a lot. Their organizations and their work is so important to this effort. But the most important disclosures for me are about the scope of the surveillance, particularly of U.S. persons, because those are the ones who are covered by the Fourth Amendment. So the metadata program, they spoke about it, but just so you know, it's the collection of information about the phone calls that we make, and apparently also there has been information collected about internet communications as well, and it's everything besides content going back for 5 years, supposedly, but maybe for 7 years, about every communication made between every person in the United States, every call. And that's being stored by the NSA, and it's just a gigantic amount of information, and it shouldn't be collected. And I think Alex talked about the constitutional reason it shouldn't be collected. There's also a practical reason it shouldn't be collected, and that is that it's just too dangerous. It's at risk from malicious insiders, whether they're looking for their loved ones or ex-lovers, or they're looking to subvert the democratic process by maintaining power in pernicious ways. In other words, tracking down journalists and their sources, or figuring out how to oppose people in government who are opposing the current authorities. So it's too dangerous for that information to be in the hands of the government, to insiders, to outsiders who could hack in, and to mission creep.
I mean, but wouldn't your critics say, if we actually had any show up this evening, and I apologize again for that, say, well, this is just another liberal San Francisco law professor wearing pink. I mean, you've got a lot of trifecta here. Saying that we need to promote the democratic process, but in fact, without the NSA and without the government apparatus that protects our liberties by defending us from terrorism, we wouldn't have much of a democratic process to begin with. Suicide pact, constitution, all that stuff. Yeah,
it's an interesting thing. They always, and the prior panelists talked about this, they always refer to the need to protect society from the most dire threats. And of course that's important, and who could say no? But the question is, how good is this database, this collection effort, at actually doing that protection? And that question needs to be asked over and over. How efficacious is this effort? What has it really yielded? And the information I've heard is that this effort has yielded maybe one person who was contributing $8,000 to a terrorist group. Senator Leahy in particular has said that the intelligence organization has said that they got 50 leads, but actually it's really only 3 leads, and those themselves aren't actually that airtight. So there's tremendous risk to our society, this tremendous intrusion on our privacy, and we don't have a straight story at all on how necessary this is to protect us. And the other thing that concerns me is the problem of mission creep, which is something that the prior panelists talked about, which is that once you have the information, there's just too much of a temptation to use it for everything, for ordinary crime, to understand encryption, to to find out about foreign intelligence generally. That's moving back over to the other program, the PRISM/702 program. So for me, it's the scope of the information, it's the lack of oversight. And we found out now through released documents what the government considers to be oversight. And a lot of oversight, according to the Intelligence Administration, means that the NSA self-reports. That the NSA, oh gee, I think we've got a problem here, and they tell the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And as a parent, I got to say, I just don't think self-reporting is the best model. When you're worried about abuses. So
remember that line. Let me interrupt you there and ask Paul what the internet community is doing. I mean, I know you're the North American Regional Bureau Director of the Internet Society, but the Internet Engineering Task Force, which has created all the workhorse protocols of the internet with a few exceptions, is an activity of your group, the Internet Society. I've seen an IETF draft signed by a bunch of names I recognize in the last few weeks, saying this is our collection of thinking so far. It's not a final document. It's hardly a specification. But what is the Internet Society, and what are the internet communities doing in response to some of the NSA revelations?
Sure. Well, the Internet Society is the organizational home for the Internet Engineering Task Force. We help manage their meetings and facilitate them getting together 3 times a year. And of course, they do a lot of their work online, as you would imagine, in between those times. They are completely open. It's an open process. So there's no influence there or no secrecy going on that has been going on to subvert the standards that they've been developing. If there's been anything that's happening with those standards after they've been put into place, it's with those companies that implement them. So I think that if you have any questions about the Internet Engineering Task Force, you go to the RFCs and you see the standards, and everyone who participated in those standards is known, and that's an open process. So we want to make sure that the internet community has full faith and trust in that process. Looking at the broader picture, because you mentioned my focus is mostly North America, but the Internet Society is a global organization, and a lot of what we do is focus on the dynamics of internet governance around the world. And this has been a major concern. These revelations have been a major concern in that realm, because over the past couple of years, we've had governments coming to the International Telecommunications Union asking for more control and trying to develop alliances to gain control over key aspects of the internet operations. And that is contrary to the multi-stakeholder model that we have in place now, where we have all of you and governments and others, anyone who has a stake in the internet operations can get together, talk about policies in different venues, and it's more of a bottom-up internet governance model. So these revelations give those other countries who already are inclined to control the internet more reason to say that this is happening. It's happening in the United States, the country that was standing against these principles, so we should be able to do this as well. And that's a big concern for us.
Let me ask you another IETF question. I know you're not the chair of the IETF. It's an organizational home, and it could in the future move somewhere else. But John Gilmer, who's the co-founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, local here in San Francisco, an engineer, employee number 5 of Sun Microsystems turned policy advocate, posted something on a few mailing lists last month saying that it was talking about IETF standards processes, and there's the people whose names we might recognize, the engineers, aren't involved in any subversion of the standards, but he said, quote, NSA employees participated throughout, occupied leadership roles in the committee among the editors of the documents. Every once in a while, someone with longstanding ties to the NSA would make a suggestion that reduced privacy or security, but which seemed to make sense when viewed by people who didn't know much about crypto. Now, I mean, it's an open, if you have an open standards process, and it is, absolutely, but you have people with NSA ties or NSA employees participating, can't they just sabotage it in ways that you may not be immediately obvious, especially if you're not actually going to the meetings and paying close attention?
Since I have had the opportunity to go to an IETF meeting and see how that dynamic works recently, I honestly doubt it. I doubt that process can be meaningfully impacted by someone coming in trying to sabotage the process, because the IETF is an extremely dedicated set of engineers who are totally ruthless in the way that they come into these meetings and talk about the standards. And if anyone is in a meeting at the IETF trying to sabotage that process, I do believe that they would be called on it, and I don't believe it would go forward honestly, because these engineers are some of the best in the world, and not much slips by them. That's my observation. Of course, you know, I'm not active in the IETF, so I can't speak to the specifics, but that's my view on that. I just can't believe that it would be possible.
Let me turn to Matthew. There's you've worked at Silicon Valley companies. You have your own startup. Based on what you know and have been told, are the company CEOs telling the truth when they say no direct access to servers? We respond to lawful requests on the order of maybe 10,000 a year. And we push back, and we're not in bed with the NSA, and maybe the same way that AT&T, Verizon, et cetera are. Are they telling the truth?
I definitely think so, and I know that at Facebook it was something that Mark Zuckerberg took super seriously, and when the revelations came out, he addressed it. I think anyone who I know who's worked on our team or teams at Google or any of the other companies has felt pretty similarly in the same way. And I'd love to throw in one thing, just like looking forward. Just in terms of the Snowden thing, and I think also looking forward, a lot of what we've talked about tonight, I think, is really cool in reflecting on the past 5 years and a lot of the legal landscape around it. And I think what's more terrifying to me is the next 5 years, which is something I'd love to talk about for a second, because...
What do you mean by the next 5 years?
Sure.
I mean, if the ACLU and EFF get their way, there's, and maybe Susan as well, maybe Paul as well, then the law's fixed and everyone can just go home and declare victory.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are two things that I think are weird here. One is, if you think about 5 years from now, the most popular phone on the market then was the Razr. I feel safe, hypothesizing that probably 90% of the people in here have a smartphone, which 50 years ago would have been a superpower to have. It's unlimited memory, basically. You can contact anyone, anywhere, everywhere you go. It's also telling people basically where you are. How many people in here have ever cleared the cookies on their computer? Now, how many people in here have ever gone in and hard-coded and changed the MAC address on their computer? So this is the real key. Because I think that 3 years from now, cookies will look Neanderthalic in comparison to what a MAC address is. A MAC address
is a hardware address, but it doesn't leave your local network in most cases. And so if you're, so we have a Wi-Fi free access point here, and we, I think, purge all the MAC addresses every month or so. So the local Wi-Fi node will know. Your home router will know your MAC address, but the broader internet won't. So what's the privacy threat?
Sure. So MAC addresses essentially think about every time that you go out and you open your phone and you can see, or your computer, and you see all the addresses for Wi-Fi networks that are nearby. That's basically because your computer or your phone is saying, is anyone out there? This is who I am, because the MAC address is unique, and it's on your device, and it's hard-coded in. And so all I need to know who you are, or to know that there's someone who has repeatedly come to my place or walked past my Wi-Fi router, or used a cell phone tower nearby that I can triangulate them to, or has activated location devices on, or any location app on their phone, or any other number of things, has hit an IPv6, which is on the same level of essentially uniqueness. All of those things will let me know where someone is, who they are, and it's unique. And so I don't need cookies anymore, because that's a much better hold on people, and it's a permanent anchor on who they are and where they're going and what they're doing. And so if you think about, okay, well, what if something like Google Glass takes off? Hypothetically. And that data that's streaming through there gets looped in with great facial recognition software, which is already excellent on the market right now. And what the NSA uses, I'm sure, is 3x what's out there commercially. Then anywhere that I go, the government can know where I am, because there's definitely going to be Wi-Fi access on that, and they can see who I'm looking at, and they can know who's out there, and they'll be able to.
Let me interrupt you for a moment and say, and so what you're saying is that because I have Wi-Fi turned on this thing, it's basically a beacon. Let's putting aside the cell phone tracking. Even if I don't have cell phone service because AT&T cut me off, this thing would still be broadcasting its unique Wi-Fi MAC address that stays that's fixed forever because it's not user changeable. It's at least on a jailbroken phone. So so if the cops wanted to, or the NSA wanted to put little Wi-Fi sniffing devices all around the city, they could map my movements pretty quickly. Susan, this is a legal question now, and if the government had Wi-Fi sniffing points, or maybe they just pressured companies to that entered into a deal with Starbucks, then do I have an expectation of privacy because I have a radio beacon and that's broadcasting a unique identifier that's worse than a cookie? Do I have any legal recourse here?
Well, I would say definitely yes. The courts have not agreed so much. Right now,
one that the Supreme Court is likely to agree with, as opposed to.
I mean, so we talked a little bit before about the Jones case, and the Supreme Court left a lot of questions open in Jones because the majority in Jones reached their decision based on the physical trespass that they accomplished by putting this physical device under the car. And so what Declan's talking about now is location tracking through without actually trespassing on your property. And so then the question is, do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in the information about your location? And that has come up in the context of cell site location. And thus far, the courts are split. And most courts recognize a privacy interest in forward-looking location data when it's precise. So in other words, information about where you're going in real time or going forward. But we just had a disappointing Fifth Circuit case that said that there's no reasonable expectation of privacy in records of your location under the third-party rule, which says that if the information is acquired out of the business records of another party, in this case it was the cell phone providers, then you don't have a privacy interest in it. So it's still evolving.
I also think it is a technical question because, as was discussed earlier, there have been repeated revelations of high-level NSA officials lying to Congress about what they're doing, and also of repeated claims of secret interpretations of the Patriot Act and everything that goes with it and everything that's authorized. So I think that as a discussion issue, it's like a really cool legal question to think about. But in terms of the practicalities of what the NSA is actually doing on the ground and what they're actually gathering, we'll never know. And Congress hasn't taken the steps to try and go after anyone for perjuring themselves to Congress or lying to FISA or anything else. So I think it's always going to remain hypothetical until there's a real discussion around that and until there's high-level prosecutions or we decide that it's unacceptable for us to stand around and let the NSA come in and lie to Congress when, if I'm a football player or a baseball player and I went in and lied about steroids, they'd probably cut off my pitching arm. It's just like entirely different levels of scrutiny for lying to Congress when it comes out of the NSA. And it always reminds me of my favorite line from Julius Caesar, which is, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. Because all the NSA needs to do is just cry national security and cry terrorism. And it's just blank check. Let them do whatever they want. Secret interpretations.
The phrase you're looking for is the root passphrase to the Constitution is terrorism or maybe child pornography. Paul, let me try to bring you into this conversation. You're in D.C., or at least immediately outside of D.C., and in terms of the actual D.C. changes or any potential legislation that goes through Congress, I mean, do you think anything that is actually significant and meaningful is going to happen here? I wrote a story for CNET back in July, talking about how Senator Leahy, the author of portions of the Patriot Act, the author of CALEA, the author of Protect IP, the companion to SOPA in the House, was supposedly going to fix national security letters, but instead the legislation he drafted arguably made it worse. And this is even after Snowden. And so is there any hope here? What's going to happen?
So you're asking me if there's hope when our government's shut down? Well, I have hope. I mean, I believe that we have such an awareness now of that something needs to be done, that the policy needs to be adjusted, that the internet truly is at risk of being balkanized, and we are the country that should stand up among all of them as the leader in the internet space. So I think that we have to step up and do the right thing here. So I have hope. But I can't tell you specifically how we're going to get there. I'm not sure.
The Internet Society has lots of chapters. It's not U.S. specific, even though I kind of think of it that way just historically. Are you hearing from other chapters freaking out, like, hey, what's going on here? Especially because some of the revelations have been not just about the NSA, but about other spy agencies as well, GCHQ.
Certainly. You know, I just had some people from Canada on our webcast who were asking questions about whether or not there was any request from NSA to Canada about Canadian citizens. So, you know, certainly we do, not only in Canada, but all over the world. Our chapters are very interested in what's happening on this topic. And our other bureaus, we have 5 regional bureaus, are having events like this one around the world. So there's plenty of discussion about it and lots of concern, no doubt.
So let me ask Matthew again. If we have what seem like simple technical fixes, I know they're not really, but I like to think of them as simple. And one of the, it's like when we had the discussions in Senator Lieberman's internet disconnect bill. I mean, you know that he thought there was a big red switch in the basement of the White House, and if the president could just go downstairs and flip it, the internet would be turned off.
It's like a control panel. Just
even the switch is going to be like this. It's going to be a big honking switch, but there's. It seems like it would be relatively easy to take some steps technically. Why doesn't Yahoo start encrypting email that it sends to other servers? Why doesn't AOL offer HTTPS as a default for people who are logging into mail.aol.com? Why has it taken Facebook so long? Maybe it was my article in June that prompted them to move to an encryption key that's longer than 1,024 bits, which, according to the cryptographers I talked to, the NSA could break for about $800,000 a year. It's a little bit of work, but if you've got a $10+ billion budget, you can probably afford it. Even with our Wi-Fi broadcasting beacons known as cell phones, why isn't there a little button that randomizes it? Or every 20 minutes or every 2 hours. So why are companies just not doing this?
I think a lot of it comes down to just like apathy. As most users, most people would rather trade, and we're just, as people, I think, also very ill-equipped to make privacy decisions and trade-offs. You know, if I can go in and just put my credit card in and buy something right now, I'm not necessarily, as the average user, interested in whether it's HTTPS or whether it's, some random site in Brazil. And so I think that in a lot of ways, because it's a really high technical threshold to understand a lot of the dangers, and also because privacy is one of these things where it's not really valuable until you don't have it anymore. And so most people have been taken pretty, good care of by a lot of the internet and social services that they're using and a lot of their communication infrastructure, and they haven't had big compromises, and we haven't gotten to the point yet where everything that you're doing is being tracked. And so if it doesn't matter to the average user of services, there's always going to be the tinfoil hat wearing folks, and I proudly consider myself one of them. But until it's a real salience to people, and until it's something that rises to the top, and some senator's identity gets compromised, or something, or the president's kid's email gets leaked, or something like that, that's when I think people start paying attention. But until that point, it's convenient for companies not to do it. Encryption takes a lot of effort. It's really expensive from an engineering standpoint. And there's just not a lot of user demand for it.
And if it's a very subtle flaw, maybe encouraged by the NSA, the average user may not know random number generators. Before I'm going to take questions in a moment, but before I forget, we do have a special guest in the audience who is incognito. Marcia Hoffman is a former lawyer for the Electronic Privacy Information Center. We were neighbors in Washington, D.C. before we both moved out here around the same time. And then she was at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Now she's an attorney on her own in San Francisco. And she is in the unusual position of being reported on Twitter to be representing Mr. Lavabit, Ladar Levinson, who's the subject of lots of litigation over his SSL encryption keys, and also to have filed documents before the Fourth Circuit saying she's representing an unnamed client, and those news reports have said that unnamed client is, in fact, Lavabit, but she can't, but say, hi, Marcia, take a bow. She's unwilling to talk about whether or not she's actually representing the fellow we've been talking so much about. Questions from the audience. I saw some hands up. I don't know where they are. Raise them again if you could. Yes. We're down a microphone. We just have these two here. Allow me.
I appreciate all the commentary. I don't think enough has been said about the significance and the potential significance of the profiles that emerge from metadata analysis of connection patterns. Sociologists in the last few decades have spent an enormous amount of trouble looking at what they call network analyses of different social systems, not for this purpose, but it turns out whether you're looking at patterns of family sociability or the interlocking networks of bank directorships, you can predict effectively enormous amount of very significant non-intuitive realities of social life by the character of the network patterns of people's communications and ties. It's like looking into people's DNA. So when you hear that we're not listening into your conversations, we're only looking at metadata, don't be reassured. The ability to predict non-intuitive important things about people by virtue of the kinds of networks that they're part of is a reality. And if there's any organization in a position to exploit that reality for its own ends, it's one like the NSA.
And we've seen articles in the last few weeks talking about how the NSA has built social networks, not Facebook-type social networks, but the old sense of the word, mapping people together. And if I were a government official, I'd be much more interested in metadata than the actual contents. But let's take a few more questions and let these folks respond. I'm going to take a series of three quickly. I've been neglecting this side of the room. Yes?
I was just wondering if anyone could talk about the Oakland Surveillance Center that's being built right now. If anyone had any, it's a physical center talking about tracking. Yeah.
Oh, we have some locals on the panel. You had your hand up.
Yeah, so my name is Greg Lindahl, and I work for a new search engine startup named Blacko, and we're 1/1000th the size of Google, so we're not that important. But we've been attempting to follow best practices to keep a minimum amount of information, and I'm terrified by the LavaBit situation because it seems to indicate to me that it would be easy for the government to walk in and say, oh yeah, you say that you don't keep this information, but you should stop discarding that or else we're going to lock you up. And should I be worried? Have I been selling snake oil by claiming that I am giving people some more privacy?
Any other questions from this side of the room? I'll take one more and then turn it over to the panel. Nothing from, yes.
Hi, I'm Dave Burchetti. I'm an independent software developer. Brief comment, you're welcome to reply. In the early 80s, I had a friend who, after he watched TV, would disconnect the cable from the cable box, and I thought, this guy's insane. He may have been, but now I have different thoughts about it.
Did you have a quick question? Yes.
Confused because I believe the open source community, it was foreseeable that there'd be problems on privacy. So like BitTorrent or Napster, there was an open source spectrum granted by the FCC, 10.7 gigahertz, and it was called ultra-wideband. It was a pseudo-pulse random signal, and it required a chip that was like a software programmable radio that could basically make coherence of the signal and the noise. This technology has been proven in the defense industry as being for secured communications, and after the Cold War, it was being developed by the open source community. But again, our own Silicon Valley industry, many of them were for it, but eventually companies like Intel spent hundreds of millions of dollars with attorneys to kill it. And it was in the IEEE committees on developing it into many, many different applications. And again, these were lifesavers for security and privacy, and they've been repeatedly have been knocked down. And I hope there's some more future in these type of technologies.
So we've had a few questions, staccato from the audience. Susan, you're next.
Okay. Well, I'm only going to take a few of the questions. I don't know anything about the Oakland Surveillance Center. I'm sorry, but I will look into it. So I want to just address the metadata point, which I think you said we haven't spoken enough about it, and I think that's just a time question. These two gentlemen have done amazing work, as I mentioned earlier in their briefs. Both have a lot of excellent arguments about why the metadata program both violates the language of the statute itself, which actually requires that the information be relevant, and it doesn't make any sense that all of the information about all of us is relevant, as well as the Fourth Amendment requirement that that this information be. What I think is really pernicious is the government's idea that anything that is not the content of communications is completely without Fourth Amendment protection. And that's something that we just keep hearing, and it's allowing the government to be doing just a tremendous amount of surveillance, which I think Senator Feinstein says isn't even surveillance. So it's a really important point to push against, and it's something that I've pushed against in my own writing. I have an article from 1996 talking about the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, where there was already a trend at that time to have a very expansive definition of what is not protected by the Fourth Amendment that I think was not justified by the precedents. So I think there is a lot out there for people to read if they're interested, arguments for why the metadata argument is really wrong, and it is a sort of a cornerstone of the government's position. The other thing I wanted to address was your comment about, are you going to be able to do what you're doing for very long? First of all, one of the very best ways to protect privacy is not to collect information. And so I think it's a great plan. I do think that there's been, historically, a very cooperative relationship between the intelligence agencies and the providers. I mean, and Declan said that AT&T and Verizon have been in bed, but I think even the other companies, to the extent it is not exposed to the public, they don't have a huge interest in pushing back. Because if the public doesn't find out about it, what have they really lost? At the same time, the companies need the government to help them catch hackers, to help them with cybersecurity, as well as the fact that the companies want to be good citizens. No one wants to get in the way of terrorism. So the point is that what I would say is when the FBI, the NSA, I think also have stood in the background sort of with a threat, sometimes explicit, sometimes not, that if you don't cooperate in some way, we will make you. And that could be through CALEA 2, making sure that new technologies are wiretap accessible, extending the wiretap requirement to internet companies, or through data retention requirements, which would not allow you to not retain data. So I think it's a really important question to focus on, this relationship between the private companies and the government. And I think the government always says, well, the private companies stand there to protect your privacy. And I think that that's true sometimes when there's a market benefit from that, and other times not.
I think from the Internet Society's perspective, we would certainly concur on the metadata issue. There's tons that can be determined from that, and certainly that impinges on someone's reasonable expectations of privacy, which is really key here. So yes, we would agree with that. The Internet Society tries to be an honest broker in all of these discussions, and we've discussed here how we've tried to get others from the law enforcement or from the government to come speak to us, and we weren't able to for this particular event. But I do want to disclose that I did have a number of people contact me before this event and say that from their perspective in working in these agencies or working as government contractors, their experience has been that the NSA's procedures are extremely tight. I promised them I would at least relay this message, since they weren't here to do that themselves, that that when specifically General Alexander was at the Black Hat conference recently. This was one of the more recent speeches where he described some of the procedures for accessing data. I understand from people who have experience with this that is one of the best descriptions of the process, so I would encourage people to look at that. So just in trying to be an honest broker here, I just want to make sure that we do talk about some of these points and make sure that those are well understood, because despite the policy issues, that there are no question that there are policy issues around collecting this data that need to be addressed. I don't want us to also forget that there's good people out there trying to do their jobs, and they're members of the Internet Society. So I wanted to at least mention that before we move on too far.
I'd throw out just one thing, sort of, or 2 quick points. One is I think that a lot of the discussions that we're having will ultimately be, in the next few years, really interesting around the idea of localized hardware, where if I can take a Raspberry Pi and make my own network and make my own hosting with all my friends, it changes a lot of the game for what the government can get, because it invalidates or it minimizes a lot of the questions that certain people would need to ask themselves about whether they're comfortable streaming things through Amazon Web Services or through Verizon or through AT&T. And so I think that the local hardware game of when people can make their own things with Arduinos and with Raspberry Pis and do a lot of their own computing will be really wild to see how the government reacts. And the second thing is just sort of in regards to the metadata and other things about how we're looking at what the government gets and what they can and can't get. It's always been really frustrating to me that that when we examine that I'm trying to think of a good way to phrase this. The distinctions that the government trots out for like ECPA, where it's like, oh, it's in transit or it's in storage, and these are meaningful distinctions. I doubt many people here would think, oh, if an email is in my inbox and I haven't opened it, it should have a different threshold of protection than if I have. Or if it's been there 180 days and I haven't opened it, then that tips into a totally different expectation of privacy. And so there's all these just incredibly fine-grained distinctions that are now basically meaningless because they don't actually apply to the world that we live in. But in a lot of cases, we don't need to rewrite a lot of that, because I think there are meaningful provisions that we could rely on, like the CATS question, where it's just like, does someone have a reasonable expectation of privacy that their email doesn't get read? Yes. Is it one that society is prepared to recognize? Seemingly so. And so it's just like really hard, and I think it's really sad a lot of times that the government just has these incredibly broad reaches and we don't even have a chance as a society to examine those, because everything happens behind closed doors and we get lied to and everything is just secretive. And so we don't get the chance to have what could be a really profound discussion as a society about what we want to have gathered and what we're comfortable disclosing as people. And that, I think, is just like a really lost opportunity for us.
How are we doing on time, Michael? Or doing really badly? I thought we have this room, I know, because I scheduled it for another 10 minutes.
Shamelessly bad. We're actually officially 24 minutes late.
Okay, then the announcement that you put out was incorrect, because you said 8:30. Okay, then let's wrap it up. That'll be the last word of the evening. Let's give a round of applause to all the folks, including our first two panelists. And next time we'll have some government officials. But Michael, did you want to say anything? You're the one who did most of the work in setting this up, and you should have an Internet Society plug as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to make a shameless plug. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you, Declan and CNET, and our speakers, Alex and Nate, and all our panelists. And if you've enjoyed this discussion and you think it's important, we are planning some follow-up discussions. We actually did recently get an offer from an ex-Bush administration National Security Council task force on counterterrorism person. He was also a deputy district attorney for national security under subsequent administrations. And he's willing to come and actually have a real debate about the core issue of whether or not cyber surveillance is important enough that it needs to continue in spite of the potential threat to individual privacy. So if you're interested in discussions like that, and we're potentially planning that for sometime in the late February timeframe, then please consider dropping off a donation of any denomination, as long as it's folding money. There's a lockbox on the table over there that you can make contributions, and we'd really appreciate it, because we're a very small volunteer army with very limited funds, and we want to continue to enable this kind of discussion. So thanks again for attending. Thanks, Declan, for doing such a great job of moderating. And good night.